Welcome to Speak English Daily Classes. Today's topic is the Dictionary of Body Language by Joe Navarro. Have you ever wondered what people are saying without using words? Their expressions, gestures, and body movements can reveal important clues. In this lesson, you will first listen to the full story. Pay attention to the events and try to understand the meaning naturally. After the story, I will give you a short passage from the story to read aloud. Then we'll finish with a vocabulary challenge. So, sit back, listen carefully, and enjoy the story. Let's begin. Daniel had always believed that he was good at understanding people. He could usually tell when someone was happy, angry, or nervous, and he often trusted his first impression. If a person smiled, Daniel assumed they were friendly. If someone avoided eye contact, he thought they were hiding something. If a person crossed their arms, he believed they were being defensive. To him, people were like simple puzzles. Look at the right movement and the answer would appear. That belief changed on a rainy Monday morning. Daniel had recently started working at a small consulting company in the center of the city. The office was on the 8th floor of a modern building, with large windows overlooking crowded streets. Every morning, people arrived carrying coffee, laptops, and half-finished thoughts. Some walked quickly, some moved slowly, some greeted everyone. Others went directly to their desks. Daniel enjoyed watching them. He did not think of himself as someone who was secretly studying people. He simply found human behavior interesting. While waiting for the elevator, he noticed who stood close to others and who kept distance. In meetings, he noticed who leaned forward and who leaned back. When someone received unexpected news, he watched their face before listening to their words. He thought these observations made him intelligent. Then he met Mr. Harris. Mr. Harris was the senior manager of Daniel's department. He was a quiet man in his late 40s, always dressed neatly, always carrying a dark notebook. He rarely spoke more than necessary. When he listened, he looked directly at the person speaking. When he disagreed, he did not immediately interrupt. He simply became still. Daniel noticed that stillness during his first meeting with him. The meeting was about a new client. Daniel had prepared a short presentation, and he felt confident. He explained the project, described the possible strategy, and finished by saying that the client would probably accept the proposal. Mr. Harris did not respond immediately. He leaned back in his chair. His hands rested quietly on the table. His face showed very little emotion. Daniel looked at him and thought, he doesn't like the idea. A few seconds later, Mr. Harris asked Daniel to explain one part of the proposal again. Daniel became nervous. He assumed that the question meant his presentation had failed. He began speaking faster, adding information that nobody had asked for. He explained every small detail, hoping to convince his manager. But Mr. Harris raised one hand gently. Daniel stopped. The manager smiled and said that the proposal was promising. He had only wanted Daniel to explain one assumption before approving the next step. Daniel felt embarrassed. After the meeting, he returned to his desk and thought about what had happened. He had seen the man's posture. He had seen his still face. He had noticed the pause. Then he had created an entire story in his mind. That was his first important mistake. A few days later, Mr. Harris invited Daniel for coffee. They sat near the office window while rain moved slowly across the glass. Mr. Harris opened his notebook, but instead of discussing work, he asked Daniel an unusual question. "How quickly do you think you can understand a person?" Daniel smiled. He said that he could often understand people quite quickly. Mr. Harris looked amused. Then he explained that understanding people was not the same as guessing what they were thinking. That distinction stayed with Daniel. A gesture, he explained, was only a piece of information. It was not a complete sentence. A person might cross their arms because they feel uncomfortable, or because they are cold. or because that is simply how they like to sit. Someone might avoid eye contact because they are nervous, or because they are thinking, or because they are looking at something else. Someone might smile because they are happy, polite, embarrassed, or trying to make another person comfortable. The same behavior could have different meanings. Daniel listened carefully. Mr. Harris told him that one of the most useful habits in observing people was to look for patterns instead of isolated movements. Daniel had heard the word pattern many times, but he had never thought about it in this way. Pattern was not one gesture. It was a group of behaviors that appeared together, especially when something changed. That evening, Daniel began paying attention differently. The next morning, he arrived early and sat quietly in the office cafe. Instead of trying to decide what people were thinking, he simply watched. A colleague named Maya entered first. Daniel had always considered Maya extremely confident. She walked quickly, spoke clearly, and usually looked comfortable around everyone. That morning, however, something was different. She entered quietly. She placed her bag on the chair instead of the floor. She checked her phone twice. She looked toward the meeting room, then toward the elevator. Her shoulders seemed slightly tense. Daniel almost immediately decided that she was worried about something. Then he stopped himself. He remembered Mr. Harris. Observe first, interpret later. So Daniel continued watching without creating a story. A few minutes later, Maya received a message. Her face changed. She took a slow breath, relaxed her shoulders, and smiled. Daniel noticed something important. He had not needed to guess. He had seen a change. Later that morning, Maya told the team that her younger brother had been in an important examination and she had been waiting for his result. The message had told her that he had passed. Daniel smiled when he heard this. His first instinct had been correct, but that was not what impressed him. What impressed him was how easily he could have been wrong. He could have assumed that Maya was angry. He could have thought she was unhappy with the team. He could have imagined that she had received bad news about work. Instead, he had waited. That small decision changed the way he looked at people. Over the next few weeks, Daniel began practicing this new way of observing. He paid attention to how people behaved when they were comfortable, because a normal state gave him something to compare with later. He noticed how a colleague usually sat during meetings, how another person normally spoke, and how quickly certain people answered questions. He began to understand the importance of a baseline. A baseline is simply the way a person normally behaves when nothing unusual is happening. Without a baseline, Daniel realized, a change could be confusing. Imagine that someone is usually relaxed, speaks slowly, and keeps their hands still. If that person suddenly begins tapping their fingers, speaking quickly, and moving constantly, the change may be meaningful. But if another person always taps their fingers, moves constantly, and speaks quickly, those behaviors may simply be normal for them. This was becoming more interesting than Daniel expected. One afternoon, he tested the idea during a team meeting. A new employee named Ethan was presenting a report. Daniel noticed that Ethan kept touching his watch. At first, Daniel thought Ethan was nervous. But then he remembered not to jump to conclusions. He watched Ethan for several minutes. The touching happened every time someone asked about the schedule. It did not happen when people discussed the financial numbers or customer feedback. Daniel began to notice a pattern. When the conversation moved toward deadlines, Ethan's movements increased. When the subject changed, he became still again. After the meeting, Daniel discovered that Ethan had been worried because he believed the project deadline was too short. The gesture itself had not told Daniel the whole story. The context had helped him understand it. This became one of Daniel's favorite lessons. Context matters. A person standing with their arms crossed in a warm office may mean something different from a person standing with their arms crossed outside on a cold morning. Someone looking toward the door during a long meeting might be bored, or they might simply be expecting a delivery. Someone becoming quiet might be angry, tired, thoughtful, embarrassed, or distracted. Body language is not a dictionary where every movement has one fixed definition. It is more like a language whose meaning depends on the situation. After the meeting, Daniel wrote down what he had learned. The important clue had not been Ethan touching his watch. The clue was the change. The movement appeared whenever deadlines were discussed and disappeared when the subject changed. That difference mattered. From then on, Daniel tried to separate observation from interpretation. First, he described what he could actually see. Then he considered the situation. Only after that did he form a possible explanation. He was discovering that good observation required curiosity, not certainty. People were more complicated than gestures, and that was exactly what made them worth observing. Daniel began to understand that body language was not about discovering secret answers. Section 2. The signals we miss. The more Daniel practiced observing people, the more he realized how often he had been looking without really seeing. At first, he noticed only obvious things. A smile, a frown, crossed arms, someone turning away. But gradually, his attention shifted toward smaller changes. Shoulders tightening during a conversation, hands becoming unusually still, a voice becoming quieter after a particular question, feet slowly turning toward an exit. None of these details gave him a complete answer. Yet together they gave him something valuable, a reason to pay closer attention. Daniel became especially interested in the gap between what people said and what their bodies seemed to express. He quickly learned that this gap did not automatically mean dishonesty. People could sound confident while feeling uncertain. They could smile while feeling uncomfortable. They could remain quiet because they were thinking, not because they were hiding something. That realization changed the way he looked at everyone around him. One Monday morning, Daniel prepared for an important meeting with a potential client named Richard Cole. Richard owned a growing technology company and wanted help expanding his business. The meeting mattered enough that Mr. Harris asked Daniel to attend and take notes. When Richard entered the room, he appeared confident. He greeted everyone with a firm handshake and a friendly smile. He spoke clearly, sat comfortably, and used open hand movements while explaining his company's success. Everything about him suggested control. Then Mr. Harris asked a direct question about finances. Something changed. It was subtle. Richard's smile faded for a moment. His hands stopped moving. He leaned slightly backward and glanced toward the window before answering. Daniel noticed the change immediately. His first thought was simple. Something is being hidden. But he stopped himself. He remembered what Mr. Harris had taught him. A first impression was not a final answer. Daniel considered several possibilities. Perhaps Richard disliked discussing money. Perhaps he needed time to remember the numbers. Perhaps the question had surprised him. Perhaps the subject simply made him uncomfortable. So Daniel wrote only what he could actually observe. Behavior changed when finances were discussed. He did not write, "Richard is hiding something." That difference mattered. After the meeting, Daniel asked Mr. Harris what he had noticed. Mr. Harris said he had noticed the same shift. But he explained that a behavior change was not proof of anything. It was simply a signal that could lead to better questions. Daniel understood. Observation should sharpen inquiry, not rush judgment. A few days later, more information became available. Richard's company had recently taken on significant debt to finance its expansion. He had been uncomfortable discussing the subject because he feared the consulting team would see the debt as a weakness. Daniel felt relieved. His observation had been useful, but his first assumption would have been wrong. The experience left a lasting impression. A person's body can show that something matters to them without explaining why it matters. The signal can point toward a subject, cannot always tell the entire story. Daniel began seeing this principle everywhere. One afternoon, he noticed Maya speaking with a colleague named Laura. Laura was normally energetic and expressive. She often moved her hands while talking and laughed easily. But during this conversation, her behavior changed. She became quieter. Her shoulders lifted slightly. Her hands stayed close to her body, and her fingers moved in small, repeated motions. For a moment, Daniel thought she was uncomfortable. Then he stopped himself. He did not know, so he continued walking. Later that day, Laura came to Daniel's desk and asked for help with a presentation. Her behavior was completely normal. She was relaxed, engaged, and confident. The contrast stood out. Her earlier behavior was probably connected to that particular situation, not to her personality. Later, Daniel learned the context. Laura and Maya had been discussing a disagreement about a project. Laura was not afraid of Maya. She was not angry with the company. She was simply uncomfortable with conflict. Context had changed the meaning. Daniel began to understand that discomfort did not have one universal expression. Some people became quiet. Others spoke faster. Some smiled more than usual. Some moved constantly. Others became very still. There was no single reaction that belonged to everyone. This became even clearer when Daniel met Sam, a new colleague. Sam rarely made direct eye contact while listening. He often looked slightly downward or toward the side. At first, Daniel wondered if Sam was shy. But after several days, Daniel noticed that Sam behaved the same way with everyone. He listened carefully. He remembered details. He asked thoughtful questions. He completed his work accurately and confidently. His behavior was not necessarily a sign of discomfort. It was simply his normal communication style. Daniel realized that behavior becomes more meaningful when it differs from a person's usual pattern. That led him to an important idea: baseline behavior. A baseline is the way someone normally behaves when nothing unusual is happening. Without knowing that baseline, it is easy to misunderstand people. A restless person may not be nervous. A quiet person may not be unhappy. Someone who looks away may not be avoiding the truth. Meaning often becomes clearer when there is a change from normal behavior. Mr. Harris later gave Daniel an exercise. He asked Daniel to describe people without using words such as confident, nervous, friendly, rude, or dishonest. Daniel found it difficult. He tried to describe one colleague by saying that the man was confident. Mr. Harris stopped him. That was an interpretation, not an observation. Daniel tried again. He described the man's posture, tone, speaking pace, and eye direction. This time, Mr. Harris nodded. Daniel began to understand the difference. One description explained what he believed. The other described what he could actually see. If he said, "She is nervous," he was already interpreting. If he said, "She is speaking faster than usual, moving her hands more often, and touching her necklace repeatedly," he was describing behavior. The second approach was more useful because it left room for other explanations. Daniel started practicing this everywhere. On the train home, he watched people without staring at them. He noticed how passengers behaved when they were alone and how their behavior changed when someone they knew joined them. One man sat quietly with a serious expression. When his friend arrived, his face became brighter. His posture moved forward, and his hands became more active as he began telling a story. Daniel noticed the transformation. The man had not become a different person. The situation had changed, and his behavior had changed with it. The next morning, Daniel saw something similar in a coffee shop. A woman sat alone with her laptop, relaxed and focused. Then someone approached her from behind. Her reaction was immediate. She closed the laptop halfway. Her shoulders tightened. Her hands came together. Daniel's mind immediately began creating explanations. Maybe she was worried. Maybe she was suspicious. Maybe she did not trust the person. Then he stopped. Observe first. Wait. Look for more information. A few seconds later, the person greeted her warmly. The woman's face relaxed, and she opened the laptop again. There had been no serious problem. She had simply been surprised. Daniel almost laughed at himself. He realized that the human mind preferred quick explanations, even when they were wrong. So he changed his thinking. Instead of saying, "This is what it means," he began thinking, "This might mean something. I need more information." That small change made him calmer. It also made him a better listener. He interrupted less. He noticed hesitation more clearly. He became more aware of changes in energy during conversations. Section 3. The face behind the words. The following week, Daniel began noticing something different about himself. He was no longer rushing to understand other people. Instead, he was becoming curious about his own reactions. The discovery came during an ordinary conversation. Daniel was sitting in the office cafe when Mr. Harris asked him about a report. Daniel had finished it, but there was one small mistake. He had planned to correct it before sending the final version. When Mr. Harris mentioned it, Daniel immediately felt uncomfortable. His shoulders tightened, his voice became slightly faster, and he started explaining why the mistake had happened. Then he noticed what was happening. His body had reacted before he had consciously decided how to respond. That moment made him pause. Until then, Daniel had mostly been studying other people. Now he realized that his own body was constantly communicating with him as well. Mr. Harris noticed his expression and smiled. He explained that understanding people became easier when you first became familiar with your own normal behavior. Daniel found the idea surprisingly powerful. If he did not understand his own reactions, how could he confidently interpret someone else's? That afternoon, he began thinking about facial expressions. The face seemed obvious at first. Happiness looked like a smile. Anger looked serious. Surprise looked wide-eyed. But the more Daniel observed, the more complicated the face became. People smiled for many reasons. They smiled because they were happy. They smiled because they were being polite. They smiled because they were embarrassed. Sometimes they smiled because they were uncomfortable. Daniel remembered a meeting from the previous month. One employee had smiled several times while receiving criticism. Daniel had assumed the person was not taking the meeting seriously. Now he wondered if he had misunderstood. Perhaps the smile had been a way of managing discomfort. Perhaps it had helped the person remain calm. Perhaps it was simply their natural reaction under pressure. The face could give clues, but it could also create confusion when viewed without context. A few days later, Daniel had a chance to practice. The company was interviewing candidates for a new position, and Daniel was asked to sit in on one interview. The candidate was named Emily. She entered the room with a pleasant smile and introduced herself confidently. Her voice was clear, and she answered the first questions comfortably. Then Mr. Harris asked about a previous job. Emily's expression changed. Her smile disappeared. She paused, and her eyes moved briefly downward. Daniel noticed everything. But this time, he did not create an immediate explanation. He simply watched. When the conversation moved to another subject, Emily relaxed again. Then Mr. Harris returned to the previous job, and the same change happened. Daniel recognized the importance of repetition. One reaction could be meaningless. A repeated reaction to the same subject was more interesting. After the interview, Daniel asked Mr. Harris what he thought. Mr. Harris said Emily clearly became uncomfortable whenever that job was discussed. But discomfort did not automatically mean guilt. There could be many reasons. Perhaps she had left after a difficult experience. Perhaps she had a conflict with her manager. Perhaps she had made a mistake there and still felt embarrassed. The correct response was not to invent a story. It was to ask a respectful question. Daniel realized that good observation could improve conversations because it showed where more understanding was needed. The following day, Maya came into the office looking tired. Her eyes appeared less focused than usual, and she spoke quietly. Daniel wondered if something had happened. Before asking, he remembered that people could have many reasons for looking tired. Later, when they were alone, he simply asked if everything was okay. Maya smiled and explained that she had slept badly because her apartment building had been noisy during the night. Daniel smiled. Again, his observation had told him that something was different. It had not told him why. This was becoming a recurring lesson. The face could show a change. The body could show a change. The voice could show a change. But the reason still belonged to the person. Daniel began appreciating the difference between noticing and knowing. Noticing could happen immediately. Knowing required more information. That distinction protected him from becoming overconfident. One afternoon, Daniel and Mr. Harris were preparing for an important presentation. They discussed how to handle a difficult client. Mr. Harris asked what Daniel would do if the client suddenly became quiet during the meeting. Daniel thought for a moment. He said he would not immediately assume the client was angry. He would consider what had just been discussed, compare the behavior with earlier behavior, and look for other changes. If the silence continued, he would ask a simple question. Mr. Harris smiled. That was exactly the answer he wanted. Daniel was beginning to understand that reading people was not a performance. It was a process. Observe. Compare. Consider context. Look for patterns. Then communicate. That afternoon, Daniel received another practical lesson. During a team discussion, Peter suggested an idea that nobody immediately supported. There was a short silence. Peter smiled, but his face looked tense. His shoulders lowered slightly, and he leaned back. Daniel noticed the change. Before, he might have thought Peter was embarrassed. This time, he waited. A few seconds later, Peter asked whether the team thought his idea was useful. His voice sounded uncertain. Daniel realized that the silence had affected him. People can react not only to what others say, but also to how others respond to them. A person's body can change because of another person's expression, tone, or silence. Communication is a continuous exchange. One person reacts, the other notices, then they react again. Daniel started seeing this everywhere. In meetings, one person would lean forward when another began speaking. In conversations, a listener might smile or nod when becoming more interested. When a subject became uncomfortable, the energy might drop. Sometimes the change was almost invisible. But once Daniel started paying attention, he could see it. He also discovered something important about eye contact. Before, he had believed that strong eye contact meant confidence and avoiding eye contact meant nervousness. Now he knew better. Eye contact depended on the person, the situation, and the conversation. Some people naturally maintained strong eye contact. Others looked away while thinking. Someone might look away because they were uncomfortable. Another person might do the same because they were trying to remember something. The behavior alone was not enough. So Daniel stopped treating eye contact as a simple test of honesty. One evening, he was speaking with a friend at a quiet restaurant. His friend was telling him about a difficult decision. At one point, the friend stopped speaking and looked down. Daniel noticed the pause. But instead of filling the silence, he waited. Several seconds passed. Then his friend continued. Daniel realized that his silence had helped. He had given the other person space to think. For the first time, he understood that observing people was not only about noticing movements. Sometimes the most useful thing to observe was a pause. Pause could mean uncertainty, could mean emotion, could mean someone was searching for the right words. And sometimes it simply meant they wanted time. The next morning, Daniel wrote a sentence in his notebook. Do not rush to fill every silence. Then he added another. People often reveal more when they feel safe enough to stop performing. That idea stayed with him. Daniel began noticing that people behaved differently when they felt relaxed. Their movements became more natural. Their voices became less controlled. Their expressions became more spontaneous. This helped him understand another important principle. People often become easier to understand when they are comfortable. But comfort depends on circumstances. A person could be relaxed with friends and tense in a formal meeting. Someone could be confident at work and nervous in a social situation. Personality was not one fixed performance. It changed with circumstances. That afternoon, Daniel received an unexpected call. It was from Richard Cole, the client from the earlier meeting. Richard wanted to meet again. When they met the following day, Richard appeared different from before. He seemed less confident. His voice was quieter. He sat closer to the table and kept his hands together. Daniel noticed the changes immediately, but he did not assume anything. He remembered Richard's earlier baseline. This was different. Daniel asked how the company was doing. Richard paused, then admitted that the expansion had become more difficult than expected. The financial pressure was greater than he had predicted. Daniel understood why Richard looked different. It was not necessary to decode a secret message. Richard was simply under pressure. His body had reflected the situation. As they continued talking, Richard slowly relaxed. His shoulders lowered. His hands became more active. His voice became stronger. Daniel watched the transition. Comfort was returning. He realized that body language could work in both directions. You could notice discomfort, but you could also notice increasing comfort. That was just as important. After the meeting, Daniel returned to the office and told Mr. Harris what had happened. Mr. Harris said Daniel was beginning to understand the real value of observation. It was not about catching people. It was about responding to them more intelligently. Section 4. When words and behavior collide. A few days later, Daniel arrived at the office expecting an ordinary morning. Instead, Mr. Harris asked him to come into his office. There was a serious problem. A major client had complained that confidential information from an important project had somehow reached a competitor. Only a small group of employees had access to the information, and nobody knew how it had happened. Daniel immediately noticed the atmosphere. People who normally joked together were suddenly careful with their words. Conversations became shorter, and employees looked at one another with uncertainty. Nobody wanted to be suspected. Mr. Harris explained that he did not want Daniel to investigate people like a detective. He simply wanted him to attend several conversations and notice changes in behavior. The goal was not to find a guilty person through body language. It was to notice where conversations became important, uncomfortable, or emotionally charged. The first person they spoke with was Sam. He explained that he had worked on the project for several weeks, but had not shared the information with anyone outside the team. He appeared calm and answered directly. Daniel noticed that Sam occasionally looked away while thinking, but that was normal for him. His posture, voice, and manner were almost exactly the same as usual. Daniel made a simple note. No significant change from baseline. The next employee was Laura. She was visibly uncomfortable from the beginning. Her hands moved frequently, and she kept adjusting a small object on the table. When Mr. Harris mentioned the competitor, she became even more tense. Daniel noticed the change, but he did not assume guilt. Perhaps Laura was worried about the company. Perhaps she feared losing her job. Perhaps she simply disliked being questioned. Mr. Harris asked where she had been when the confidential information was accessed. Laura hesitated. Then she explained that she had been working from home that afternoon. Her voice became faster as she described the timeline. Daniel wrote only what he could observe. Change when discussing the timeline. After the conversation, he told Mr. Harris that Laura's behavior had changed. but that the change did not prove anything. Mr. Harris nodded. That was exactly the point. Later, Daniel spoke with Peter. Peter was normally energetic, but this time he appeared unusually relaxed. He leaned back and spoke confidently. When Mr. Harris asked whether he had shared any project information, Peter immediately said no. His answer was clear. But Daniel noticed that Peter had been tense during earlier discussions about the project. Now he seemed almost too relaxed. Daniel wondered whether this mattered. Then he reminded himself that unusual calm could have many explanations. Perhaps Peter had become more comfortable. Perhaps he was confident because he had done nothing wrong. Perhaps he simply wanted the conversation to end. Daniel refused to turn one impression into a conclusion. As the interviews continued, he saw how difficult it was to separate observation from interpretation. Every person behaved differently under pressure. Some became nervous. Some became angry. Some became extremely calm. Some talked too much. Others became silent. The same emotion could produce completely different behavior in different people. That evening, Daniel realized that people often misunderstood body language because they expected it to work like a dictionary. They wanted one gesture to equal one meaning. Crossed arms meant defensiveness. Looking away meant lying. Touching the face meant nervousness. A smile meant happiness. But real people were not dictionaries. A gesture could have several meanings depending on the situation. Daniel opened his notebook and wrote a new rule. Look for clusters, not isolated signals. The next morning, the investigation took an unexpected turn. The company discovered that the confidential file had been printed. Only 3 people had access to the printer room during the relevant period: Laura, Peter, and Sam. Mr. Harris called the 3 employees together. Daniel sat quietly at the side of the room and watched. Sam remained almost completely still. Peter leaned back. Laura folded her hands tightly. When Mr. Harris mentioned the printed document, Laura's breathing appeared to change. Her fingers pressed against each other. Daniel noticed it, but he remembered his rule. One signal was not enough. Mr. Harris asked who had used the printer that afternoon. Sam said he had printed several pages for a meeting. Peter said he had printed nothing. Laura said she had printed a document, but she could not remember exactly what it was. Daniel paid close attention. Laura's uncertainty was interesting, but it still did not prove anything. Mr. Harris checked the printer records. They showed that Laura had printed a document shortly before the confidential file disappeared. The room became silent. Laura looked down. For a moment, Daniel thought the mystery had been solved. Then Laura explained that she had printed a draft proposal containing information from another project. She had forgotten about it because she had been preparing for an urgent presentation. Mr. Harris checked the file. It was not the confidential document. Another assumption had collapsed. Daniel was impressed by how easily the evidence could have been misunderstood. If they had relied only on Laura's nervous behavior, they might have blamed an innocent person. Later that afternoon, the real answer finally appeared. The confidential file had been printed from a shared computer that was missing from the original list of devices. Someone had accessed it using an old account that should have been disabled. The problem was not a dishonest employee. It was a security mistake. Daniel felt relieved. The investigation had taught him something more valuable than discovering who was responsible. It had shown him how dangerous it could be to use body language as proof. That evening, Mr. Harris asked Daniel what he had learned. Daniel said that behavior could tell you when something deserved attention, but it could not always tell you what had happened. Mr. Harris smiled. Exactly. He explained that good observers did not search only for information supporting their first idea. They also looked for information that could prove their first idea wrong. Daniel liked that principle. It required humility. If you believed someone was nervous because they were hiding something, you had to remain open to other explanations. If someone looked confident, you could not assume they were telling the truth. If someone looked uncomfortable, you could not assume they were guilty. Behavior could reveal emotion. Emotion could reveal importance. But importance was not the same as guilt. Daniel began thinking about how useful this could be in everyday life. Imagine asking someone a simple question and noticing that their behavior suddenly changes. Instead of deciding that they were lying, ask yourself what part of the question affected them. Maybe the topic reminded them of something painful. Maybe they did not understand the question. Maybe they were worried about being judged. Maybe they simply needed time. The better observer stayed curious. A few days later, Daniel used this principle during a conversation with Maya. They were discussing a new project when Maya suddenly became quiet. Daniel noticed the change. Instead of continuing, he paused and asked whether something about the plan concerned her. Maya looked surprised. Then she admitted that she was worried about the deadline. Daniel realized that if he had not noticed the change, she might never have mentioned it. This was the positive side of reading people. It could help you notice problems before they became bigger. It could help you understand hesitation, give someone space, and ask the right question at the right moment. But Daniel also discovered that observation worked best when combined with empathy. If you noticed someone's discomfort and immediately used it against them, you could make them even more uncomfortable. If you noticed it and responded with patience, you could make them feel understood. One afternoon, Daniel watched two coworkers having a disagreement. One spoke quickly and moved his hands constantly. The other became almost completely still. To an inexperienced observer, the first might appear angry while the second appeared calm. But Daniel noticed more. The first person's voice was loud, but his shoulders were relaxed. The second person barely moved, but his jaw was tight and his breathing appeared controlled. The emotions were not as simple as they looked. Daniel realized that stillness could accompany intense emotion, while movement could sometimes help someone release tension. There was no universal formula. The more he learned, the less interested he became in quick judgments. He no longer needed every gesture to have a definite meaning. He only needed to notice what had changed and remain curious about why. That night, Daniel returned to his notebook. He wrote, "The body gives clues. The mind creates stories." Then he added, "Good observation means knowing the difference." He closed the notebook and smiled. He was beginning to understand that the real power of reading people was not predicting everything they would do. It was noticing what most people ignored. A change in tone, a sudden pause, a shift in posture, a movement toward or away from someone, a moment when words and behavior stopped matching. And sometimes that mismatch was the beginning of the most important conversation. Daniel would soon discover exactly that, because the next person he met would speak with complete confidence. But one tiny movement would make Daniel stop and listen much more carefully. Section 5. The Power of Baseline. After everything that had happened, Daniel began to understand that reading people was less about memorizing gestures and more about noticing change. That idea became important when a new consultant joined the company. His name was Marcus. He was confident, friendly, and comfortable in meetings. He spoke easily, made frequent eye contact, and often smiled while listening. At first, Daniel thought Marcus would be easy to understand. But within a few days, he realized that Marcus was unusually controlled. During meetings, Marcus sat with excellent posture and kept his movements measured. His voice stayed calm, even when discussions became tense. Daniel wondered whether Marcus was naturally calm or deliberately controlling his behavior. There was no way to know immediately, so Daniel decided to observe him over time. During the first week, Daniel watched Marcus in different situations. In formal meetings, Marcus was confident. During lunch, he was more relaxed. With senior managers, he remained polished, while with junior employees, his posture became looser and his smile more natural. Daniel noticed something important. People rarely behave exactly the same way in every situation. Behavior changes with the environment, the people around us, and the pressure we feel. That was why baseline mattered. You needed to know how someone normally behaved before you could understand what was unusual. One afternoon, Marcus was preparing for a presentation when the computer suddenly stopped working. Normally, he handled problems calmly. This time, his movements became faster. He repeatedly checked the screen, rubbed his hands together, and spoke more quickly. Daniel noticed the difference, but he did not create a story around it. He simply recognized a change from normal behavior. A few minutes later, the computer was fixed. Marcus relaxed almost immediately. His shoulders lowered, his movements slowed, and his voice returned to normal. Daniel saw that the behavior had changed with the situation and disappeared when the pressure disappeared. That pattern was more useful than any single gesture. Later that week, Mr. Harris asked Marcus about an important client. Marcus suddenly became quieter. He stopped smiling and looked toward the table for several seconds. Daniel noticed the change but waited. Mr. Harris asked a follow-up question, and Marcus explained that the client had rejected the company's proposal and wanted major changes. The mystery disappeared. His behavior had changed because the subject was uncomfortable. Again, the body had shown that something mattered, but it had not explained why. Daniel was becoming comfortable with uncertainty. Before, uncertainty made him guess. Now, it made him observe more carefully. A few days later, Daniel attended a networking event with Marcus. The room was crowded, and Daniel watched Marcus interact with different people. With one group, Marcus stood tall and spoke confidently. With another, he laughed more and used larger hand movements. Then a senior executive approached. Marcus's posture changed immediately. His shoulders became slightly more rigid. His smile became smaller, and his speech slowed. Daniel noticed the shift but did not assume fear. He considered the context. The executive was someone Marcus respected. Daniel began to understand that body language was often relational. People could behave differently because of who was around them. The same person might appear confident with one individual and nervous with another. That did not necessarily mean their personality had changed. The relationship had changed. This became clear when Daniel noticed that Nina behaved differently around her manager. With teammates, she spoke freely and joked easily. When her manager entered the room, she became quieter and more formal. Daniel initially wondered if she disliked him. Later, he discovered that Nina simply respected her manager and wanted to appear professional. Again, the explanation was less dramatic than his first assumption. Daniel began to see how easily people could be misread. A nervous-looking person might simply care deeply about the outcome. A quiet person might be concentrating. Someone who speaks little might be listening carefully, while someone who speaks constantly might be managing their own nervousness. There were always possibilities. The skill was learning to notice without immediately judging. One evening, Daniel tested himself in a cafe. He watched a man sitting alone with his phone. The man looked serious and repeatedly checked the screen. Daniel imagined several explanations. Maybe he was waiting for important news. Maybe he was worried about work. Maybe he was expecting someone. Then the man received a message. His expression changed completely. He smiled, relaxed his shoulders, and began typing. Daniel smiled to himself. Sometimes you do not need to guess. If you wait long enough, the situation explains itself. That lesson stayed with him. Patience was becoming one of his strongest tools. The next morning, Daniel joined another meeting with Richard Cole, the client who had previously been under financial pressure. Richard seemed much more relaxed this time. He joked with the team and spoke confidently about the future. His posture was open, his voice was stronger, and his movements were natural. Then Mr. Harris mentioned the company's debt. Richard's behavior changed. His smile disappeared, he leaned backward, and his hands became still. Daniel recognized the pattern. This was not the first time Richard had reacted to that subject. He still did not assume anything, but now he knew the topic mattered. Mr. Harris asked a careful question, and Richard admitted that the debt was still causing problems. Daniel realized that good observation could help people reach important subjects without forcing them. You notice the change. You slow down. You ask. Then you listen. Later, Mr. Harris told Daniel about another important element: timing. A behavior meant more when you knew exactly when it appeared. If someone crossed their arms after hearing a particular statement, that timing could be useful. If they had been sitting that way for 20 minutes, it meant something very different. Daniel understood. The sequence mattered. What happened before the behavior? What happened afterward? Did the behavior appear suddenly? Did it disappear when the subject changed? Did it become stronger when the pressure increased? These questions could reveal more than the gesture itself. Daniel began paying attention to sequences. During one meeting, a colleague smiled when receiving praise, then looked down when the team discussed responsibility for a mistake. The smile was ordinary. The second reaction was more interesting because of when it appeared. In another conversation, someone became restless only after a deadline was mentioned. Daniel realized that transitions could be especially revealing. But sometimes people were not aware of the signals they were giving. Their body could react before their conscious mind had decided how to respond. That did not make body language a lie detector. It simply meant that emotions could appear physically. A person might become tense when discussing something important or relax when a difficult subject was resolved. These reactions were human, and Daniel began seeing them with more empathy. One afternoon, Marcus made a mistake during a presentation. For a moment he froze. His face became tense, and his voice stopped. Then he took a breath and continued. Afterward, Daniel told him that nobody had noticed the mistake. Marcus laughed and admitted that he had felt embarrassed. Daniel smiled. His body had revealed the emotion before he had spoken about it. But the important part was what happened next. Marcus recovered. Daniel realized that observing a reaction was only half the story. You also needed to notice recovery. How quickly did someone return to normal? Did reassurance help? Did tension remain? Did they avoid the subject afterward? Recovery could reveal how strongly a situation affected someone. That evening, Daniel wrote in his notebook, "Do not only watch the reaction. Watch what happens after it." He looked at everything he had learned. Know the baseline. Notice changes. Look for clusters. Consider context. Pay attention to timing. Watch recovery. Most importantly, never confuse observation with certainty. Daniel felt that he was finally becoming good at this, but he was about to discover something even more difficult. Sometimes the biggest clues were not in what people did. They were in what they stopped doing. And the next conversation would teach Daniel why silence, stillness, and absence could sometimes speak louder than movement. Section 6. The silence between the signals. By now, Daniel had become much more careful when observing people. He no longer searched for one gesture that could reveal everything. Instead, he watched for changes, patterns, timing, and context. But one thing still confused him. Sometimes a person could become more difficult to understand not because they started doing something unusual, but because they suddenly stopped doing something they normally did. That lesson began with Peter. Peter was usually one of the most active people in meetings. He asked questions, made comments, challenged ideas, and often joked when the atmosphere became tense. His energy was easy to notice. But during an important planning meeting, Daniel noticed something unusual. Peter said almost nothing. At first, Daniel thought Peter might simply be tired. Then the meeting continued, and Peter remained silent. When someone asked for his opinion, he gave a short answer and stopped speaking. His usual hand movements were gone. He did not make his usual jokes. He barely moved. Daniel noticed the absence of his normal behavior. That was different. After the meeting, Daniel did not immediately ask what was wrong. He waited until they were alone and asked whether everything was okay. Peter hesitated, then admitted that he disagreed with the direction of the project but did not feel comfortable saying so in front of everyone. Daniel understood something important. Sometimes what disappears can be just as informative as what appears. If a normally talkative person suddenly becomes quiet, the silence may deserve attention. If someone who usually makes strong eye contact suddenly avoids it, the change may be worth noticing. If a person who normally jokes becomes unusually serious, the difference can tell you that something has changed. But again, Daniel reminded himself that the change was only a clue. Peter's silence had a reason, but Daniel could not have known that reason simply by observing him. A few days later, Daniel saw another example. Maya was preparing for a presentation. Normally, she rehearsed out loud, moved around the room, and asked everyone nearby for feedback. On this occasion, she sat quietly at her desk and read the same page repeatedly. Daniel noticed. He asked if she needed help. Maya looked up and smiled. She said she was fine. Daniel did not push her. Later, she admitted that she was nervous about presenting to the company's senior executives. Daniel realized that silence could sometimes be a way of controlling emotion. People do not always express stress through obvious movement. Some become restless. Others become still. That difference made Daniel even more cautious about simple rules. One afternoon, Mr. Harris gave Daniel another lesson. He asked him to watch a short conversation without hearing the words. Daniel observed two people speaking across a table. One person leaned forward while the other remained still. The first person used many hand movements. The second barely moved. When the conversation ended, Mr. Harris asked Daniel what he thought had happened. Daniel said the first person seemed more engaged. Mr. Harris asked why. Daniel explained that the person leaned forward, moved naturally, and responded with frequent facial expressions. Then Mr. Harris asked whether the second person seemed uninterested. Daniel hesitated. He said he was not sure. Mr. Harris smiled. That was the correct answer. The second person could have been bored, tired, nervous, deeply focused, or simply naturally still. Without the words and context, there was not enough information. Daniel was learning that good observation sometimes meant accepting that you did not know. That was difficult. People naturally want certainty. They want to look at a person and understand them immediately. But real human behavior is complicated. A gesture can have several meanings. A silence can have several meanings. Even a smile can have several meanings. The safest approach is to collect information before forming a conclusion. That evening, Daniel thought about his own behavior. He realized that he also had patterns. When he was nervous, he spoke faster. When he was concentrating, he became quieter. When he felt comfortable, he used more hand movements. When he was tired, he looked away more often. If someone had watched him without knowing his normal behavior, they might easily misunderstand him. That realization made him more patient with others. He understood that people deserved the same patience he wanted for himself. The following week, the company faced another difficult situation. A client had delayed an important payment, and several employees were worried about the company's finances. Mr. Harris called a meeting to discuss the problem. Everyone seemed tense. But Daniel noticed something unusual about Marcus. Marcus was normally expressive during meetings. He often leaned forward, asked questions, and occasionally smiled when someone made a good point. This time he was completely still. His hands remained on the table. His face showed very little expression. His voice, when he finally spoke, was calm but unusually quiet. Daniel noticed the change. He did not assume Marcus was angry. Instead, he waited. As the discussion continued, Marcus became even quieter. Finally, Mr. Harris asked him directly what he thought. Marcus paused. Then he explained that he had received information that the client might cancel the contract entirely. The room became silent. Suddenly, Marcus's unusual behavior made sense. He had known something the others did not. His silence was not random. It was connected to information and concern. Daniel realized that behavior often became meaningful only after the missing context appeared. That was why patience mattered. If he had judged Marcus too quickly, he might have misunderstood him completely. After the meeting, Daniel asked Marcus why he had not mentioned the information earlier. Marcus explained that he had wanted to confirm it before creating unnecessary panic. Daniel understood. Sometimes people become quiet because they are processing information. Sometimes they are protecting themselves. Sometimes they are protecting others. Sometimes they simply do not know what to say. Silence does not have one meaning. That lesson stayed with Daniel. Later that week, he was talking with Maya when she suddenly stopped smiling. Daniel noticed the change. Instead of asking what was wrong, he simply continued the conversation naturally. A few minutes later, Maya brought up a personal problem herself. Daniel realized that giving someone space could be more effective than immediately asking questions. Observation was not always about speaking. Sometimes it was about creating enough room for the other person to speak. This became especially useful when Daniel met a nervous young employee named Alex. Alex had recently joined the company and seemed uncomfortable during group discussions. He rarely volunteered ideas and often looked down when senior employees spoke. Daniel initially wondered if Alex lacked confidence. But during a one-on-one conversation, Alex became completely different. He spoke clearly, asked intelligent questions, and explained his ideas with enthusiasm. Daniel understood immediately. Alex was not necessarily an unconfident person. He was uncomfortable in large groups. The environment had changed his behavior. Again, context changed the meaning. Daniel began to see that people often had different versions of themselves in different environments. Someone could be quiet at work but expressive with friends. Someone could be nervous in meetings but confident when speaking about their expertise. Someone could appear serious in public and playful in private. Trying to define a person from one situation was almost always incomplete. One evening, Daniel and Mr. Harris were walking through the office when they passed a small group of employees. Everyone was talking except one person. Daniel noticed the person standing slightly apart from the group. Mr. Harris asked what Daniel saw. Daniel described the person's position, expression, and lack of participation. Then Mr. Harris asked what it meant. Daniel smiled. He said he did not know yet. Mr. Harris nodded. That answer showed how much Daniel had changed. At the beginning, he would have immediately created a story. Now he could observe without rushing to judge. A few minutes later, the person joined the conversation and began laughing with everyone else. There had been no hidden problem. He had simply been listening. Daniel smiled. Another assumption avoided. The more he practiced, the more he realized that observation was closely connected to patience. If you react too quickly, you may misunderstand. If you wait, more information often appears. That did not mean people should be watched suspiciously. It meant attention should be combined with respect. Daniel also learned to notice when people became more comfortable. A conversation might begin with stiff posture and short answers. Gradually, the person might lean forward, smile naturally, speak more freely, and use more gestures. Those changes could indicate growing comfort. Daniel found this especially useful when meeting new people. Instead of trying to impress them immediately, he focused on making the conversation comfortable. He listened. He asked simple questions. He gave them time. And often, the other person became more expressive naturally. That was when Daniel understood another important lesson. Sometimes the best way to read people is to stop trying so hard to read them. If you make people feel watched, they may become more controlled. If you make them feel comfortable, their natural behavior often becomes easier to notice. Section 7. What reading people really means. The next morning, Daniel arrived at the office thinking about everything he had learned. He felt more confident, but he also understood that confidence could become dangerous if it turned into certainty. He had learned to notice behavior, compare it with a person's baseline, consider context, watch for patterns, and give people the benefit of the doubt. Yet he still wondered whether he could use these skills naturally, without constantly analyzing everyone around him. That morning, Mr. Harris asked Daniel to join an important meeting with a potential business partner named Thomas. Thomas arrived on time, dressed professionally, and immediately created a positive impression. He shook hands confidently, smiled naturally, and spoke in a calm voice. During the meeting, he explained his company's plans and answered questions confidently. Daniel noticed steady eye contact, open gestures, and a relaxed posture. Everything seemed comfortable. Then Mr. Harris asked about the company's previous financial performance. Thomas answered immediately. His words sounded confident, but Daniel noticed something small. Before answering, Thomas briefly pressed his lips together and looked down for less than a second. It was almost nothing. Daniel remembered his rule. One signal was not enough. A few minutes later, the conversation returned to future plans. Thomas became energetic again. His hands moved naturally, his voice became stronger, and he smiled more. Then Mr. Harris returned to the company's previous financial results. The same small change appeared. Thomas paused, his expression tightened slightly, and his eyes moved downward before he answered. Daniel noticed the pattern but did not decide what it meant. Perhaps Thomas was embarrassed about the company's past. Perhaps the numbers were complicated. Perhaps there had been a difficult period he preferred not to discuss. The important thing was that the subject mattered. Mr. Harris asked another question. This time, Thomas's answer became longer and less specific. Daniel did not assume dishonesty. He simply noted the areas that needed clarification. After the meeting, Mr. Harris asked Daniel what he thought. Daniel explained that Thomas seemed confident overall, but his behavior changed whenever the conversation returned to the company's previous financial results. His answers also became less specific. Mr. Harris nodded. That was useful information. They did not accuse Thomas of anything. They simply requested additional financial documents before making a decision. A few days later, the documents arrived. They revealed that Thomas's company had experienced serious financial difficulties 2 years earlier. Thomas had not technically lied, but he had presented the situation in a way that made the company appear stronger than it had been. Daniel was surprised. His observation had not discovered a secret. It had simply told him where to look more carefully. That was the difference. He had finally learned how to use observation responsibly. The experience taught him something else. People do not always lie with their words. Sometimes they leave things out. Sometimes they change the subject. Sometimes they give technically correct answers that create a misleading impression. And sometimes they avoid information because they are embarrassed or afraid. The body cannot tell you which explanation is correct. Only further information can do that. Daniel realized that this principle applied to friendships, family conversations, job interviews, negotiations, and ordinary conversations. Whenever words and behavior seemed slightly different, the correct response was not suspicion. It was curiosity. Ask another question. Listen carefully. Give the person room to explain. Then compare what you learn with what you observed. That evening, Daniel met Maya for coffee and told her about the meeting with Thomas. She asked whether he thought Thomas had been lying. Daniel thought carefully. He said he did not know. He only knew that Thomas behaved differently when discussing his company's past financial performance. Maya smiled. She said that answer would have surprised the Daniel she had met several months earlier. Daniel laughed. She was right. At the beginning of his journey, he had wanted simple rules. He wanted to look at someone's face and understand what they were thinking. Now he understood that real people did not work that way. You could notice clues quickly. You could become better at recognizing emotional changes. You could become more aware of posture, facial expressions, gestures, voice, distance, timing, and silence. But you could never remove uncertainty completely, and that was okay. In fact, accepting uncertainty made observation more accurate. Daniel thought about the mistakes he might have made if he had believed every popular body language rule. He might have judged quiet people as dishonest, mistaken nervousness for guilt, interpreted crossed arms as rejection, assumed strong eye contact meant confidence, or believed looking away meant someone was lying. Now he understood that these behaviors were clues, not verdicts. The real skill was learning someone's baseline and noticing meaningful changes. It was understanding context, looking at groups of signals instead of isolated gestures, paying attention to timing, and noticing what happened before and after a reaction. Most importantly, it was asking questions instead of inventing answers. Daniel's experience also changed the way he listened. Before, when someone spoke, he often prepared his own response while they were talking. Now he listened differently. He watched expressions without staring, noticed changes in voice, paid attention to pauses, allowed silence to exist, and stopped trying to finish people's sentences. As a result, people often told him more. He realized that understanding people was not only about reading them. It was also about making them feel understood. A person who feels judged may hide information. A person who feels safe may explain more. A person who feels rushed may give short answers. A person who feels listened to may reveal what really matters. Daniel began using this in everyday conversations. When someone became quiet, he did not immediately ask what was wrong. Sometimes he simply gave them space. When someone became excited, he encouraged them to continue. When someone hesitated, he waited. When someone looked uncomfortable, he slowed down. These small changes made his relationships easier. He was not becoming a mind reader. He was becoming a better observer and a better listener. One evening, Daniel returned to the cafe where he had once practiced observing strangers. He sat in the same place and looked around. People were talking, laughing, checking their phones, waiting for friends, and enjoying quiet moments alone. Months earlier, Daniel might have tried to guess what each person was thinking. Now he simply observed. A man was tapping his fingers. A woman was smiling at her phone. Someone was sitting quietly near the window. Another person kept checking the door. Daniel noticed everything. But he did not create stories. He understood that each person had a private world he could not see. Their behavior could offer clues, but it could never give him the whole story. That realization made the skill feel more respectful. Reading people was not about invading their privacy. It was about paying enough attention to communicate better. Daniel opened his notebook one final time and wrote the principles he wanted to remember. Establish a baseline. Know how a person normally behaves before interpreting a change. Look for clusters. One gesture rarely tells the whole story. Consider context. The same behavior can mean different things in different situations. Pay attention to timing. Notice when a behavior appears and what happened immediately before it. Watch for changes. Sometimes the most useful clue is not what someone does, but what suddenly becomes different. Listen to the words. Body language should never replace the actual conversation. Ask instead of assuming. When something seems important, give the person a chance to explain. And finally, remember that observation is not certainty. Daniel closed the notebook. He realized that he had started this journey wanting to read people instantly. but he had discovered something better. You do not need to understand someone instantly. You need to notice them carefully. You need to stay curious. You need to listen. And you need to remember that every person is more complicated than any gesture, expression, or posture. The face can give you a clue. The hands can give you a clue. The voice can give you a clue. Silence can give you a clue. But none of them can tell you the whole story. The whole story comes from observation, context, conversation, and time. Daniel smiled as he closed his notebook. He had started by searching for a way to read people. He ended by learning how to understand them. And perhaps that was the real lesson. The goal is not to look at another person and immediately decide who they are. The goal is to notice more, assume less, listen better, and respond with greater understanding. Because when you learn to observe people without judging them too quickly, you do not simply become better at reading others. You become better at communicating with them. And that is a skill you can use every day. In conversations, friendships, interviews, meetings, relationships, and every situation where understanding another person truly matters. Congratulations! You have completed the full story. You have not only listened to a story about reading people, you have also learned how to notice behavior more carefully, understand context, and avoid making quick judgments. Now, it is time for the next part of your English practice. First, we listen to the story. Now, we will move from listening to reading. I will give you a short passage based on today's story. Read it slowly and clearly. Do not worry about reading quickly. Focus on pronunciation, natural pauses, and confidence. After the reading practice, we will move to a vocabulary challenge. So take a breath, get ready, and read aloud with confidence. Let's begin the reading practice. Good job! You have completed the reading practice. Now, let's move on to the vocabulary challenge. You will see some words from today's story on the screen. Your task is simple. Try to understand the meaning of each word, and write your answers in the comments below. Don't worry if you don't know every word. Take your time, think about the context, and make your best guess. This simple practice will help you build your vocabulary and remember new words for a longer time. Thank you for learning with me today. Keep practicing, keep reading, and keep speaking English every day. I'll see you in the next class. Until then, keep learning and keep improving.